This video is made possible by NordVPN. We live our lives online more and more these days, particularly over the last year, and unfortunately that means that cybercrime is also on the rise. That's where NordVPN comes in. With NordVPN, all your internet data stays safe behind a wall of next-generation encryption, and that's the kind of safety that we should all be thinking about. As we've seen in just the last year in Hong Kong, Myanmar, and Belarus, political situations can change rapidly, bringing censorship restrictions and intrusive government controls. Well, NordVPN provides a kind of invisibility blanket. You can mask your IP address so that others can't see what you are browsing online. Remember that NordVPN has servers all over the globe, meaning that you can enjoy instant secure access to hundreds of streaming websites worldwide. And one account lets you connect up to 6 devices, which means that you get to watch VisualPolitik content from anywhere on the planet. And right now, you can get a huge discount on a 2-year plan of NordVPN at nordvpn.com/visualpolitik. And you'll get an additional 4 months for free. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. And now, it's Grant's turn.
Have you ever thought about what would happen if your country literally started to become extinct? That is, if its population were to decline, people were to grow older, the labour force were to become scarce, and many schools, towns, and neighbourhoods were to gradually become empty. Well, this is more or less the process that is already being experienced in Japan, the country with the oldest population in the world. Check this out. Today, 1 in 4 Japanese citizens is over 65 years old. They represent 28.7% of the entire Japanese population. As a comparison, in the European Union, another territory with many problems with demographic aging, this percentage barely exceeds 20%. In other words, if all Japanese people over the age of 65 formed their own country, that country would have roughly the population of Poland or Canada. In addition, Japan is the country with the most centenarians in the world. Approximately 80,000 Japanese have crossed the 100-year barrier. And indeed, for many experts, the process underway in Japan is just a taste of what's to come in much of the developed world in just a few decades. Precisely for this reason, Japan may become a testing ground for how to deal with the challenges posed by the reversal of the demographic pyramid. And take note, because this is not just an amusing anomaly. This issue could jeopardize the entire economic and social model of all of our countries. And this is where a few questions arise. Exactly what challenges are we talking about? How can we prevent our countries and societies from languishing in the face of an increasingly aging population? What is Japan's experience of this so far? Well, in this video, we will try to answer these and other questions. But first, let me thank, once again, all of the people who generously support us on Patreon, from the most modest contribution to the super patrons. Thanks to you, this project can aspire to improve every day. Your commitment and your help contribute to make VisualPolitik one of the leading independent political channels on YouTube. So really, from the whole team, once again, thank you all so much. Now, that said, let's get cracking.
An explosive combination.
Those of you who have watched a few videos will know that, usually, we are not very fond of bombarding you with data. But on this occasion, in order to understand what is really happening in Japan, there are some numbers that we simply must take into account. We are talking about a country with the worst possible projections in terms of aging. To give you an idea, by 2036, it is estimated that those over 65 years of age will already account for almost 35% of the entire population. At the same time, the fertility rate, which began to fall in the 1970s, is moving further and further away from the demographic replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. Well, in Japan today, this figure barely exceeds 1.4 children per woman, one of the lowest rates in the world. Although, it must be noted that South Koreans take the lead in this matter. Check this out. And of course, the explosive cocktail of more and more elderly people and fewer children leads irredeemably to one thing: the movie Children of Men. No, I'm kidding. Population contraction is what it actually leads to. In fact, since 2011, the Japanese population has not stopped shrinking. In 2020 alone, Japan's population declined by almost 400,000 people. During that year, 38 of the country's 47 prefectures lost population. In fact, Japan's population is expected to go from around 126 million in 2020 to around 111 million by 2040. And, are you ready for this one? To just over 87 million by 2065. In a little more than 40 years, Japan will lose more than 30% of its inhabitants. We are talking about an unprecedented demographic contraction.
Japan drops out of the 10 most populous countries 2020 census.
As you can imagine, these kind of demographic changes have significant implications for all areas of the country, including, of course, the economy.
Working age population projected to shrink in Japan and South Korea. An OECD report has calculated that by 2050, Japan's working age population would have declined to 61.8% compared to the population in 2000.
At this point, I'm sure most of you are wondering, all right, Grant, but what are the causes behind all this negative data? How much is the responsibility of society and how much is the responsibility of public policy? Well, let's take a look at that now.
A country that is becoming extinct.
There are only a few countries in the world that are already experiencing demographic decline. South Korea and Japan are currently two of the most prominent cases. But why? What factors are contributing to this scenario? We're going to focus on the case of Japan, but the situation in South Korea is very, very similar. The point is that we will be able to find causes and factors linked to the social and cultural aspect on the one hand and to the economic political aspect on the other. Let's start by taking a look at the first factors. Firstly, the Japanese labor market is probably one of the most anti-family friendly markets in the world. The Japanese have to deal with extremely long working hours that often leave little room to even consider starting a family. What's more, in the case of Japan, requesting medical leave or parental leave is frowned upon and can have professional consequences. Let's just say that despite the fact that Japanese law recognizes 36 weeks of paid maternity leave and the country leads the world in paternity rights with 30 weeks, cultural barriers still weigh very heavily. For example, to give you an idea, despite the provisions of the law, men who apply for paid paternity leave are still in the minority and usually barely reach 2 weeks of leave, far less than what is legally recognized. Another social factor affecting birth rates is the increasing tendency of the Japanese not to form couples. According to the latest available data, more than 35% of the population in Japan lives alone. And what is more surprising, many Japanese people do not even bother to have a partner. So, if you want a fling, it's not really clear whether going to Japan is a great idea or a lousy one. I'm sorry for all the anime heads out there. Then, the numbers also tell us that, whether for cultural or economic reasons, the Japanese are also having a lot of trouble adopting to the changing job market. You see, the Japanese labor market has traditionally been characterized by stable jobs. The general worldview was that if a worker worked hard enough, he could stay in the same company all his life, progressively improving his working conditions. Of course, such jobs, known in the country as regular jobs, have been in sharp decline everywhere since the 1990s. For example, between 1995 and 2008 alone, the number of regular workers fell by 3.8 million, while temporary and freelance positions grew by 7.6 million. And what do the demographics tell us? Well, only 30% of temporary workers or freelancers in their 30s are married. That's almost half as many as regular workers of the same age. So in this case, as you can see, precariousness or perceived lack of employment security could be having an important influence. Because obviously, the more singles, the fewer children. Now, many of you may be wondering, all right, Grant, but if there's a lack of children and a lack of workers, why not encourage immigration? And this is actually a very relevant issue. In a developed country, the arrival of immigrants has not only made it possible to maintain or expand the labor force, but has also helped to raise birth rates. However, Japan is perhaps one of the most restrictive countries in the world in this respect. As of June 2019, only 2% of Japan's population were foreign residents. We are talking about just over 2.8 million people. By comparison, Spain, a country with a population 3 times smaller, has almost twice as many immigrants, 5.5 million, which is 11.4% of the population. Clearly, this has mostly political explanations. Until 2018, Japanese immigration law only granted legal residents with a right to work to highly qualified professionals, professionals in training programs from developing countries, and students under certain conditions. In practice, visas were the property of the company and were linked directly to the employment contract. In other words, if the company had finished with you, you had to leave the country. It was as simple as that. Since 2018 though, and as we have already mentioned in previous videos, more flexibility has been introduced. For example, 2 types of labor immigrant categories have been created. The first allows lower skilled foreign workers in specific sectors to stay in the country for 5 years. However, they are not allowed to bring their families to the country. The second category allows foreigners with more advanced training to bring their family to Japan and live indefinitely, converting their visa into a permanent visa under certain criteria. In short, emigrating to Japan is a trial despite the fact that they need people like a desert needs rain. And I'm not overstating it by saying that. The depopulation that Japan is beginning to experience is already having noticeable consequences, and it has only just begun. Do you want to know more about the problems that the demographic challenge is already causing in the land of the rising sun? Of course you do, so listen up.
The looming catastrophe.
Let me throw a question at you. Did you know that in Japan there are no fewer than 896 cities and towns facing complete extinction by the year 2040? And this is no journalistic exaggeration. There are in fact official forecasts made by the National Institute of Population and Social Security Research, affiliated with Japan's Ministry of Health, Labour and Welfare. And that's not all. The percentage of vacant housing, because there are no longer people interested in occupying them, now accounts for 13.5% of all housing in Japan. About 8.5 million residencies. Another fact, between the year 2002 and 2017, more than 7,000 public schools in Japan were closed due to a lack of children. Obviously, all these problems are concentrated mainly in the rural areas farthest from the main cities, where the population continues to squeeze into tiny apartments, little bigger than a shoebox, at exorbitant prices. Something very different to what is already happening outside the major metropolises. The agricultural population can be a good illustration of this. In 2015, the 1.75 million people engaged in agriculture, no less than 63.5% were over 65 years old, a percentage that had tripled in 3 decades. This makes Japan the country with the tightest ratio of dependence to people of working age in the OECD. And by 2060, the ratio is expected to reach 1 elderly person for every person of working age. You can imagine what this means in terms of social costs. However, at least the Japanese pension system is mixed. It combines a public welfare pension with individual private savings plans. This means that the maximum public pension that a Japanese person can receive when retiring at the age of 65, after contributing 40 years to the national pension plan, is only $7,500 or 6,400 euros per year, which is equivalent to just over $628 or 530 euros per month. In Spain, for example, where demographic problems are not very different and the pension system is pay-as-you-go, the maximum pension exceeds $43,000 or 37,000 euros per year, almost 6 times the maximum pension in Japan. You can already imagine here the scenario that is brewing in Spain, and with it, the whole Eurozone. We talked in detail about this issue in a past video that I'll link for you in the description. But let's not get sidetracked. Generally, there is some consensus that a sharp drop in population will also lead to fewer workers, and thus lower output. Although, with heavy investment in capital goods such as machinery and robotics, this could be mitigated. At least, that is the hope of Japanese economists. Nevertheless, long-term economic simulations in some studies indicate that Japan's demographic debacle will cause national GDP to fall by 20% over the next century in absolute terms, and by around 5% in per capita terms. And then there is the question of public spending. For example, in 2018, Japan's healthcare spending reached 10.9% of GDP, and by 2030, it is expected to account for 12.1%. This is because healthcare spending is closely related to the age of patients. In Japan, per capita healthcare spending for those under 75 averaged $2,134 in 2018, while for those over 75, the figure soared to $9,000. That's 4 times more. In short, this is the demographic scenario facing Japan, a country that, in just 1 generation, will lose almost 1/3 of its population, and will have to deal with a downward GDP evolution and higher social expenses. Regarding the changes they are making to adapt to this situation, we covered this in detail in a past video here on VisualPolitik, and I'll link that one in the description too. The question now is, what is the solution to a demographic collapse? Will Japan end up becoming one of the countries most receptive to immigration due to the severe crisis that is knocking on their door? And will this give hope to the weebs? You can leave your opinions here below in the comments. And remember, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Once again, thank you for being there. All the best, and I'll see you next time.